The Kriegsmarine deployed a number of different U-boat designs throughout World War II, bringing a total of 1,178 individual submarines into service between the start of their rearmament program and the end of the war. Of these, the vast majority, 706 in total, were the familiar Type 7, itself a modification of a late World War I design. Coming in second place, though, was the Type 9, a much larger vessel, with 193 built, to a number of different subvariants. The primary difference between the two designs in terms of operational capability was range and weapons load. The Type 7 could only operate in the eastern Atlantic without support in the form of refueling ships or refueling submarines, whilst its range on paper allowed it to just about cross the Atlantic in both directions. This didn't account for the fuel needed to remain on station, or the fact the sub might need to travel at somewhat more than its most economical cruising speed of 10 knots. It also, in its basic form, only carried 11 torpedoes, 14 in most other variants, and a maximum of 16 on the never-completed Type 7C-42, which limited the number of attacks it could make in a conflict where the preferred World War I tactic of saving the torpedoes and instead using the deck gun was far less viable and far more dangerous. Whilst operational range would increase with the various versions of the Type 7 from 6,200 nautical miles on the Type 7A to 14,700 nautical miles on the Type 7F, only 10 Type 7s with a range above 8,500 nautical miles would ever be produced. The Type 9, on the other hand, started with a 10,500 nautical mile range and a warload of 22 torpedoes, rising to 23,700 nautical miles and 24 torpedoes with a Type 9D, with the most common variant being the Type 9C, which had just under 13,500 nautical miles range, and the related Type 9C-40 with 13,850 nautical miles range, both of which carried 22 torpedoes. This operational range compared favourably with other long-range submarines. The typical Type 9 actually outranged the Gato-class fleet subs of the US Navy by a couple of thousand nautical miles, whilst the late-war Tench class would regain the crown in that particular competition. As long as you ignore the Type 9D, both nations were generally far behind the masters of long-range submarine travel, the Imperial Japanese Navy, by quite a margin. But, not having to operate in the Pacific, the Type 9s were more than adequate to patrol whatever part of the Atlantic or the Caribbean that they liked, with the odd submarine also popping up in other areas over the course of the war, including, but not limited to, the Arctic, Antarctic, South Atlantic, Indian Ocean, but not the Mediterranean. A couple would also end up in the Pacific, all things told, but that's a separate story we'll cover later on. This is not to say that the Type 9s had an entirely trouble-free development history. Attempts at making a long-range submarine for the Kriegsmarine had started with the Type 1A, but only 2 of those were produced before it became clear that there were quite a number of performance issues. This resulted in a specification being issued at the end of 1935 for a submarine with 730 tons surface displacement, 20 knots top speed, and 14 knots cruising speed on diesel engines, a range of 10,000 nautical miles at 10 knots, and a carriage of 6 torpedo tubes with 12 reloads, so a total of 18 if you loaded the tubes before you left. It's important to note at this point that unlike most warships, submarines actually have 2 displacements. A surfaced displacement, which as the name suggests is the amount of water that a submarine displaces whilst it's cruising on the surface, and a submerged displacement, which again, as the name suggests, is the amount of water that a submarine displaces when it's fully under the water. Unless otherwise specified, we'll be using the surfaced displacement of a sub, as that's the thing that provides the most direct comparison with other warships. Using the Type 1A as a basis and incorporating these new improved requirements would eventually produce a brand new design with a larger machinery space, slimmer bows, a wider main hull and outer casing, and additional anti-aircraft guns. This iteration displaced 740 tons when surfaced, was able to make 20 knots on the water's surface and 8.5 knots underneath it, with 11,000 nautical miles range at 10 knots and 22 total torpedoes, 12 of which were carried internally, split between 6 in the tubes themselves, plus 1 reload per tube, and 10 carried in special cases between the pressure and outer hulls in containers. At the time, Germany was still operating within the limits of the Anglo-German Naval Agreement, and enough tonnage was left in the submarine category of that particular agreement for 13 of these vessels. But since you could build 3 Type 7s for every 2 of these hypothetical Type 9s, and the smaller craft could also be ready faster, the total number of initial prototype Type 9s ordered was reduced to 8, with construction contracts awarded in 1936 and early 1937, and the first boats entering service in 1938 and 1939. These would become known as the Type 9As, consisting of U-37 through to U-44, all but 3 of which would be sunk in the opening 6 months of the war, with the U-43 being sunk in summer 1943, and U-37 and U-38 surviving long enough to be scuttled by their crews at the end of the war. Compared to the final design spec, which we just mentioned, the actual in-service Type 9A was heavier, at just over 1,000 tons surface displacement, with a fractionally shorter range, 10,500 nautical miles instead of the on-paper 11,000, and a slightly slower underwater top speed of just under 8 knots as opposed to 8.5. This would then lead on to the next set of subs in the series, the Type 9B. These were slightly wider to incorporate a bit more fuel for a new range of 12,000 nautical miles, and also rearranged the deck gun locations a fraction, with 3 such subs ordered at the end of 1937, 8 in 1938, and 3 more in 1939, which would lead to an odd series of splits in the designations, these being U-64 and 65, U-103 through 111, and U-122 through 124. Of these 14 craft, all bar 1 were sunk by Allied forces during the war, with U-103 being scuttled at the end of it. 2 particular subs from this run are notable. U-110 was captured in May 1941 before sinking the next day, but not before yielding up a trove of valuable intelligence, including Kriegsmarine issue Enigma machines. And U-123 was scuttled at Lorient, but was salvaged and commissioned into the Marine Nationale post-war. Mid-1939 brought about another design revision, the Type 9C. This carried the wider amidships hull further forward, which made them just a fraction slower on the surface, but with more fuel now stored, they were able to attain just under 13,500 nautical miles of surfaced range. These subs would start to enter service between the start of 1941 and the summer of 1942, with 54 hulls being built, the second largest single run of the various subvariants of the Type 9. Their numbers were distributed across a wide range of number batches, so we won't go into those here. Only 4 of these subs would survive the war. U-155 and U-516 were scuttled by the British after examination, U-510 was handed over for France and used for a while, and U-505 would become the only continuously preserved Type 9 when it was captured by the United States Navy in the summer of 1944, and would eventually find a home in a museum in Chicago. Then you had the Type 9C-40. With a subtle increase in overall width again, range climbed to 13,850 nautical miles, with 87 being produced, the largest single run of Type 9s, and this particular subvariant also had a somewhat better run of luck. U-170, U-190, U-530, U-532, U-539, U-541, U-802, U-805, U-806, U-858, U-859, U-889, U-1230, U-1231, and U-1232, as well as U-1233, all managed to survive to the end of the war. A total of 16, although none of them actually survive today. By this point, the incremental changes had added about 110 tons to surface displacement, which might not seem like all that much until you remember that's just over 10% of the total surface displacement of a Type 9A. It's the equivalent of a 35,000-ton treaty battleship growing by just over 3,500 tons. The last subvariant of the Type 9 took a big step forward. The Type 9D was about 10 metres longer than the Type 9C-40, and whilst the pressure hull was still the same width, the outer hull was almost a metre wider. This increased surface displacement by over 50% to 1,610 tonnes, and there was one main type of Type 9D, along with two small runs of subtypes. The main Type 9D2 variant used much of the extra space due to the expanded hull for fuel, and could travel almost 24,000 nautical miles, making it one of the longest range submarines in the world at the time. 28 of these vessels would be built, with U-181, U-861, U-873, U-874 and U-875 surviving the war, the latter three, to be fair, in large part due to not actually taking part in any active missions, as they'd been commissioned, worked up and dispatched to Norway, arriving and settling in just in time for the war to end. And U-181 survived by being transferred to the Imperial Japanese Navy and surrendered by them to the Allies at the end of World War II, being one of the rare Type 9s to operate in the Pacific. The existence of the Type 9D2, however, does presuppose a Type 9D1, and indeed U-180 and U-195 were the two boats that fit this class description. U-180 seems to only have been used as a cargo or transport submarine from the start, whilst U-195 did actually engage in active war patrols, the latter boat ending up in Japanese hands and, like U-181, being surrendered at the end of the conflict, whilst U-180 was lost on her second cargo transport mission to Japan. A number of other Type 9D variants would also be used in the cargo role, with minimal to no onboard armament apart from deck guns, and the capability to transport just over 250 tons of cargo well over 31,000 nautical miles. But these were regular combat boats that were taken offline for cargo and transport use later in their careers. The last actual variant was the Type 9D-42, 6 of which were contracted, with only 2, U-883 and U-884, actually built, of which only U-883 entered service in late March 1945 and was still working up when the surrender order came. At the start of the production run, aside from torpedoes, the submarines were armed with a deck gun, usually a 105mm or 4.1-inch weapon, for taking on surface targets. A couple of smaller anti-aircraft guns were also usually installed, usually a 37mm and a 20mm installation, or according to one or two photos, perhaps only one such weapon. However, as time went on, this varied. Gradually, the 105mm was phased out in favour of more 20mm, and later, the 37mm would come back in a new and improved form, although none of the Type 9s became flak U-boats. This was something that only Type 7s did. But the exact anti-aircraft fit varied almost on a sub-by-sub basis once the war got properly on, although there was an attempt to standardise most of the surviving subs to a single 37mm and a pair of 20mm guns in 1944, but as we'll see, even that didn't stick entirely. Also making changes in the visual profile were radar detectors, to give the subs advanced warning of Allied ships or aircraft looking for them. These gradually improved in fidelity and the number of frequencies they could detect as the arms race between Allied radars becoming more precise microwave-based units and the German ability to detect these new systems was ongoing throughout the war. In the latter years of the war, the subs would also begin to receive compact radars of their own, along with schnorkels allowing them to recharge while still submerged, and a rearrangement of periscopes from 3 in the first two variants to 2 in the latter ones. Some Type 9s assigned to long-distance patrols can be distinguished by a fairing aft of the conning tower that carried an FA-330 rotor kite, which resembles a chair fitted with helicopter blades but no engine, which could be towed to help with spotting, although it was only ever successfully used in this particular endeavour once. Now, you'll notice that in all of this, only one sub survived continuously through to today, U-505 in Chicago. But there's one other Type 9 on display. How did that happen, you wonder? Well, to figure that out, let's look into its story in a bit more detail. It all starts on the 20th of February 1942, when the keel of a new sub, internally labelled Yard Job number 352, is laid down at the Deutsche Werft yards in Hamburg. Rapidly coming together, the sub goes down the slipway on the 23rd of September 1942, and 3 months to the day later, in December, she's commissioned under the command of 23-year-old Herbert Nollau, entering service with the 4th U-boat flotilla in Stettin, a city that had traded hands a number of times at that point in its history and was currently German, although it's now Polish, having come back full circle to its historical origins. The sub would remain here, training and working up for 6 months, during which time the main deck gun was removed and additional flak weaponry added, as well as testing of the then new Saukönig T5 acoustic homing torpedo was carried out. In June 1943 it was transferred to the administration of the 2nd Flotilla, which was based at Lorient in France, and in October Nollau was promoted to Captain Lieutenant. In May of the following year, the sub was told to set sail for Bergen in Norway, where it met up with U-853 and U-857, which were sister ships, before being dispatched on her first operational cruise as a weather reporting vessel in concert with the other 2 subs. Officially stationed off the south coast of Greenland, her assignment ended up taking her as far south as the Azores, as it turned out, before she was recalled to Bordeaux in France. On the 11th of August, she came under attack by Allied aircraft but managed to escape without damage, subsequently meeting up with U-857 again and the smaller U-437. The trio were then attacked on the 13th by a pair of RAF Halifax bombers, but the combined flak batteries of the 3 U-boats managed to drive off the attackers and inflict damage on the aircraft. Safely in the French port, the sub was fitted with a schnorkel and then sent out again. 2 days into this voyage, the schnorkel is used, malfunctions, and promptly gasses a number of the crew with exhaust fumes. Luckily, the sub is able to surface in time to prevent anyone from dying, but it's then promptly attacked by a Wellington bomber. However, in another turn of fate, the Wellington is shot down by the sub's flak guns. Towards the end of October, she stops over in Kristiansand, then heads on to Flensburg, where she's reassigned to the 33rd U-boat flotilla. But before she gets to that assignment, she's first dispatched to Stettin for an extensive overhaul, during which time she probably acquires a rare twin 37mm M43U flak emplacement. Unlike some previous Kriegsmarine 37mm anti-aircraft guns, this version had an actually useful rate of fire, and of course in a twin mounting offered double the firepower of the older single guns commonly found on various Kriegsmarine vessels. This meant the sub was out of action over the winter of 1944-45, re-entering service at the start of March 1945 when she headed over to Kiel, and over the next 2 months undertook a mission for which no known records survive, except for the fact that at some point she accidentally shot down a Heinkel 111 that got too close for comfort. On the 3rd of May, the sub becomes the last U-boat to leave Kiel, reaching Helsingborg the next day and going to ground, literally, flooding her tanks and resting on the seabed. Also that day, the sub receives the surrender order from Admiral Dönitz, but for some reason ignores this, instead forming up with the Type 21 U-boats U-3523 and U-3503 and heading out to sea, destination unknown. On the next day, May the 5th, they're spotted by a pair of Liberator bombers and attacked. One of the aircraft falls victim to the combined anti-aircraft fire of the 3 subs, and the 2 newer subs manage to dive, but a depth charge from the surviving aircraft actually lands on the tail of our particular sub before rolling off, falling off just off of the sub's starboard aft section before exploding, which smashes in the outer hull, causing leaks and stripping and warping the starboard prop shaft. With the engine rooms flooding, the sub begins to sink by the stern, and the crew abandon ship. 5 men are trapped in the forward torpedo room, but once the sub actually hits the seabed, they're able to open a torpedo loading hatch and complete their escape. Unfortunately, a young radio operator forgets to breathe on the way up, and the expanding air in his lungs inflicts fatal damage. 2 other men would die of exposure before the rest of the crew were rescued. The other 2 subs didn't last all that much longer. U-3523 was sunk the next day by another Liberator, whilst U-3503 was scuttled 2 days after that. None of the subs completing their final voyage, whatever that may have been. And there the submarine lay, until in August 1986 a Danish diver found the wreck, and after much discussion, a gentleman by the name of Carsten Ree agrees to sponsor raising the submarine, and in August 1993 the wreck is raised to the surface, whereupon it's found that the gradual sinking and the local conditions have filled much of the interior with silt, preserving everything from pistols to paperwork, including 2 entire Enigma machines and their deciphering sheets. After examination, the sub is transported to Birkenhead, just opposite Liverpool, and formed part of the Warship Preservation Trust collection from May 1996 until 2006, when, in a move absolutely typical of local authority planning, approval was given to redevelop the flour mills, you can see there in the background, into flats, and the adjacent area into even more buildings, and so the trust was kicked out, because clearly having one of those popular tourist destinations in the area nearby was such a terrible fate. And then, of course, the vast swathes of land on either side of the buildings were promptly not developed and spent more than a decade sitting completely empty, instead of hosting the 5 ships, including the sub, that could simply have been moved a couple of 100 yards. Without a berthing area, the trust was forced into liquidation. Of the vessels present, 2, HMS Plymouth and HMS Onyx, ended up being scrapped. HMS Bronnington was left nearby until she rotted out and sank, where she still is today, half submerged. LCT 7074, fortunately, was moved to Portsmouth and underwent extensive restoration, recently reopening, and the submarine was sort of rescued. Whilst it had been brought to its current location in one piece, as it had been, when it was launched and when it was on the seabed and when it was salvaged, it was decided for cost-saving reasons that clearly it should be chopped into bits, and then left in these sections when it was relocated to a new home adjacent to the Woodside Ferry Terminal, also in Birkenhead, and here she lay, gradually rusting out and becoming home to approximately all the pigeons. Until that is October 2021, when the sub, U-534, was transferred to the ownership of the charity that currently runs the Western Approaches Museum just across the river, and which you may be familiar with from the 2 videos I did over there, looking at its role as a headquarters of the fight, ironically enough, against the U-boats. And now there's a mission to clear out the pigeons, preserve and clean up the sub, redevelop its location into a museum that can properly show off its heritage, and sort through the warehouse worth of artefacts that came with it, putting them into their correct context, and trying to work out from the evidence available just exactly what the sub was doing sailing against the surrender order at the end of World War II. And in a literal world exclusive, you, dear viewers, will get an unprecedented front row seat and first look at the conservation and construction work as it takes place. Big Heritage, the charity in question, were kind enough to contact me and offer a simple deal. I help to track and promote the work that they're doing to restore this historic vessel, in exchange for travel and other minor expenses, along with exclusive access to the entire process and sub. Which means I get to bring you regular updates on the artifacts, technology and repair work, along with up-close and personal access to one of only 4 German U-boats from World War II still left in the world, and thanks to circumstances, the very last one of the survivors to be in operational service with the Kriegsmarine, which has its own legacy of unique artifacts that we'll be looking at over the forthcoming year and a bit. So sit back, relax, and enjoy watching the world's most heavily armed pigeon coop gradually transform into a working museum, with monthly updates starting in April on the last Friday of each month. And if you want to see even more regular updates and insights into the finds and the process involved in preserving them all, then you can follow the links in the description, where I'll be posting photos and video on a more frequent basis. Thanks of course as well to Big Heritage for reaching out and making all of this possible. And of course thanks to my newly acquired cameraman, who will be helping me from behind the scenes, and who, if you happen to be coming to see me on the US trip, you may well interact with as well. Now, with all that said, does anyone know where we can get a laser sandblaster and several cartloads of Kriegsmarine issue grey paint?
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.